bacterium, a tree, you, me, we all descend from a common microbial ancestor.
You don't meet a big man with a white beard up in the sky.
There's another entity in the universe besides matter and energy, and that entity is mind.
God is responsible for sustaining every moment and every particle of existence in the universe.
The whole point of Darwinian natural selection is that it works without design, without foresight.
I find personally atheism to be intellectually incoherent.
You cannot use evolution to account for its own existence.
Genesis is primarily telling me where I come from.
To claim that here's the scientific account and here's the creationist account, and that's the only two possible choices, is profoundly mistaken.
If there is a God, then I'd hate to meet him.
I regard the worship of a supreme being as, in a way, humanity's oldest problem.
I'm out there trying to find the truth. I'm trying to get to the bottom of things.
Uniquely within the solar system, our privileged planet pulsates with life. And most impressive of all, human beings. Creation's crowning achievement. Sophisticated, intelligent, creative. Yet physically like the animal kingdom, a tissue of muscle and skin hung on a structure of bone. The life force, a river of blood powered by a beating heart. The communication center, a sponge-like brain harnessed to millions of nerves. Simultaneously simple and complex, and very effective.
My awe at the way in which human beings are put together only grows by the day.
I am completely grateful to be alive in this spectacular place. I wish there were a recipient for my gratitude.
But how did life begin? Was it by chance or by intention? The deliberate plan of a supernatural being we traditionally describe as God. On the street, opinions are divided.
I'd say by design. I don't know why.
Theory of evolution.
I think that's just luck.
I don't know really, probably God.
But I wouldn't want to discount it because I'm always crossing my fingers and saying, oh God.
People are responding to code words. You could have a die-hard creationist who's never really read the Bible. And you could have a die-hard evolutionist who knows nothing about scientific theories.
In the science-religion debate, no factor raises the temperature more than the subject of evolution, often presented as a stark alternative to God.
Evolution is by far and away the thing that makes people nervous because it deals with our favorite species, right? So naturally, if I'm telling you, no, I'm sorry, you weren't created out of the mud like that, ex nihilo, you actually evolved from common ancestors of the monkeys and apes. Whoa, that makes people a little nervous.
That's why the theory of evolution becomes so important, right? Because it appears to be an attack on the story of creation.
For atheists, there appears to be no better weapon to derail belief in God than evolution.
Do atheists need evolution? Yes, yes, yes.
Without Darwin, we would have all this brilliant design in the biosphere and no accounting for how it got there. With Darwin, we can have a thoroughgoing naturalism. There's nothing supernatural about it.
The very conception of God has been muscled off the scientific playing field.
Some members of the Christian community also believe that evolution is hostile to God, and for that reason oppose it.
I don't find that the evolutionist approach to the science really fits naturally with theism. I don't think it sits naturally at all with it. I think the evolutionary approach sits far more naturally with the atheist starting point.
Many Muslims also find it difficult to reconcile Darwinian evolution with their faith.
One of the reasons why mainstream Islam currently tends to reject the theory of evolution is because the story of Adam and Eve is so important and so symbolic in the entire Quranic narrative in terms of our origin.
But a significant number of high-profile scientists reject the idea that they must choose between evolution and God. For them, evolution reveals the handiwork of God.
Many biologists believe God not only created the universe, but used evolution, a beautifully simple process, to evolve life on Earth.
For me, as a believer, this all makes perfect sense. This is basically science teaching us something about what was really happening with God's creative plan.
One can be both a Christian and a committed Darwinian evolutionist. I'm an enthusiastic Darwinian, and I always have been, and I've never seen any conflict between the two.
And it's something that, for example, the Roman Catholic Church has endorsed as well, that it's possible to believe in evolution and a creator. And Catholicism represents billions of Christian believers.
The idea of God is an overarching explanatory framework which accepts everything in science, including what you call Darwinism or what we might call evolution.
Charles Darwin is arguably the most controversial figure in the science-religion debate. In this program, we ask, what is the evolutionary story? And how has Darwin become the cornerstone of atheism? And we discover why some scientists remain skeptical about how much Darwin really explains, while others are convinced that evolution is God's creative plan.
Darwin, I believe, was never really an atheist. There's a lot of things he said he didn't know. I don't know whether he died with a belief in God. No one knows that.
Darwin is famously credited with shedding light on what had been an unsolved mystery, how life had developed on Earth.
Darwin is the Newton of biology. Darwin provided us with the first comprehensive theory of biology that solves so many puzzles.
Darwin's best-known work expounds his theory about how all of life on Earth evolved over millions of years from a simple beginning. The theory has dominated scientific thinking for over 1.5 centuries.
The idea that organisms, including us, all came from, as Darwin said, one or a few forms, and that ultimately we all came from inorganic matter, and it all happened naturally, no miracles.
The story of Charles Darwin's impact on science, as well as on the God question, began when he transferred to the University of Cambridge in 1827, having abandoned his medical studies at Edinburgh.
He read the Bible in the original Greek, and he read the classics. It was an all-around gentleman's education, so that he would be an adornment to perished society.
While at Cambridge, Darwin met his mentor, John Stevens Henslow, a devout Christian and botanist who encouraged him to take the position of ship's naturalist on HMS Beagle, setting off in 1831 on a 5-year voyage to make more accurate maps of the world's coastlines and harbours. Darwin had an inquiring mind, as well as a keen eye for detail, and was meticulous in recording and often collecting much of what he saw. Many of his collections are still studied in prestigious universities today.
Darwin's looking for laws. Ever since Isaac Newton, Christian gentlemen of science, were looking for laws of nature. He is investigating empirically the laws that God has established to govern creation. It's creation by law, not creation by miracle, which Darwin has in his sights.
By September 1835, HMS Beagle had reached the Galapagos Islands, where an important observation would lead to Darwin's fuller understanding of the laws of nature. Here, it was not so much the exotic creatures that drew Darwin's attention. Rather, it was the apparently undramatic differences in the beaks of mockingbirds and finches from different islands that began to fascinate him. Darwin wondered how these variations could be explained.
Well, these are the Darwin's finches in this collection. This bird is a ground finch, and its beak is adapted for cracking very, very hard seeds. So the beak is very deep and very broad. These individuals were better at doing certain tasks, for example, reaching into the crevices and picking up flower pollen. This bird is a cactus finch, so it has a much more narrow and much more shallow beak. Even small differences in beak morphology are important for their survival.
It was from such detailed observations of difference and the importance of those differences for survival that Darwin's theory of evolution emerged.
This is a vision of laws of nature established by God, not God directly intervening, not miracles in any sense, but God having established rules for his creation on earth, just as he has established rules for the functioning of his heavens.
If you look around the world, you have these remarkable similarities and differences among organisms. And what Darwin did is provide a unified theory for explaining this.
Having returned from his life-changing adventure, Darwin settled in Down House in the Kent countryside near London.
He was working on a big research project to explain the diversity of life on Earth.
For Darwin, Down House and its surrounding estate became a vast laboratory in which to experiment and think. He took the same reflective walk each day, pondering, inquiring, speculating. Eventually, Darwin was drawn to a fundamentally important conclusion. Just as finches evolve and change, so do all species. They're not fixed and unchanging as had traditionally been assumed. Even the changing shape of a bird's beak can lead to the eventual extinction or survival of the species. Darwin named this process natural selection.
In many ways, Darwin's theory has the aura of common sense.
That more organisms are born than can survive and reproduce, that there's therefore a struggle for existence.
And some of those are going to be more successful, those organisms, than others. And they're going to survive. And they're going to be reproductively successful.
Those that get through are different from those that don't. More than that, they get through because of their features, and that this leads to an ongoing, what Darwin called, natural selection.
In Darwinian evolution, no creature can will itself to develop the features it needs for survival. It must rely on random biological changes taking place. Then natural selection can go to work.
Natural selection will favour those individuals that have better adaptations to enable them to flourish in a particular place where they're living.
Darwin deduced that naturally occurring changes acted on by natural selection are the driving force of evolution. But he also reached another, and for some, deeply controversial conclusion: that all of life's diverse forms, including human beings, could have evolved step by step from one original, simple life form. After 2 decades wrestling with the ideas, Darwin published them in 1859 and gained support from a surprising quarter.
The leadership in the Anglican Church, within a matter of months, had basically, mostly, entirely accepted the idea.
And I think Darwin was always very aware that many of the people who accepted evolution very early on were indeed Christian believers.
Most of the problems that Darwin faced when his On the Origin of Species was published in 1859 were to do with public ridicule about the thought that we and apes might share a common ancestor.
But not all are agreed about how easily belief in God really aligned with Darwinism.
The theologians basically, who warmed to Darwin early, misread him. Darwin's a false friend to these people. And I think it took a while for theologians to kind of realize this. It's Darwin's theory of evolution that gives you the atheism, because there's no particular role for human beings as privileged in the eyes of God, because whatever kind of creative force there may be in the world, we're just part of the nature. We don't have any special relationship with that. So yes, Darwin may believe in some sense in a creator, but it's not a creator who has an intimate relationship with us as a species.
Darwin himself, although he was interested in religious questions, by and large wanted to stay on the sideline with respect to these things. It wasn't really his fight.
Darwin himself was not a sort of person who would speak publicly very often defending or his views and opposing misinterpretations. He left that pretty much to others.
Now, Darwin's supporters, and particularly in Britain, Thomas Henry Huxley, they were very different people.
Known as Darwin's bulldog, biologist and agnostic Thomas Henry Huxley helped crystallize the argument between science and religion in a high-profile clash at Oxford with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce on the 30th of June, 1860.
Please silence, Professor Huxley.
My Lord Bishop, I cannot see what difference it would make to any moral responsibility if I had an ape for a grandfather.
Sir, your moral responsibility as a tutor of men is never to question the absolute authority of the Scriptures.
May I remind the Lord Bishop that we are gathered here in the interests of the advancement of science.
People like Huxley put the church very firmly in their sights as something offering the wrong ideology for the modern world.
Darwin offered them a weapon with which to attack their opponents.
The publication of that weapon was to prove a crucial moment in the relationship between science and religion.
And this is the first time you get these phrases science and religion, or science and theology, and conflict and warfare. What historians now believe is that the idea of a science and religion conflict is the invention of the 19th century. There are two classic publications that occur in the late 19th century that have in the titles words like the warfare of science with theology in Christendom, or the history of the conflict between religion and science.
What you end up getting is a kind of rewritten history of the past to make it look like Galileo maybe was an atheist because he was against the Catholic Church, or that Newton was somehow an atheist and was only talking about God so he could pass muster by religious authorities. Of course, all of this is false, but that's kind of become part of the sort of folk history of science.
I think that we see something of a reflection and an echo of this going on today with the so-called new atheists, like people like Dawkins and Dennett.
More than 150 years since the famous Huxley-Wilberforce clash, this same Oxford location resonates with the God question, as Professors Dawkins and Lennox passionately debate what light science sheds on the existence of God.
No, you asked me who made the creator. You say the universe created you, Richard. Who made it then?
Everything looks designed, and so it was clearly preposterous to suggest that it was due to any kind of freak accident. Darwin came along and showed that it's not actually a freak accident, but nor is it designed.
What's coming through is that the whole process is so sophisticated, it itself is giving evidence of a rational mind behind it.
To follow the astonishing story of how that sophistication has developed from simple beginnings to the complex creatures we find in our world today, we turn to the fossil evidence in the world's rocks. Fossils buried in these layers of history can be excavated and studied. With scientists able to calculate the age of the rocks in which they are buried, a picture is built up of the extraordinary development of life over millions of years. Northwest Scotland, Among the oldest rocks in the world is evidence of the earliest forms of life to have existed on Earth.
These structures, called stromatolites, we've got out of some of the rocks on the coast of Scotland near to Loch Torridon. Little dark bubbles, which are of course cells that were living, in this case, on a beach 3.4 billion years ago. But it looks as if the further back in time we go, the smaller and simpler the organisms get.
In the evolutionary story, over billions of years, simple organisms became more complex until 500 million years ago, even more complex and varied life forms began to emerge, so quickly that their development has been described as an explosion.
We have something called the Cambrian explosion, or the Big Bang of evolution, where all the different groups of animals, which were previous soft-bodied, suddenly evolved their hard parts.
Animals suddenly, within the matter of just 10 or 20 million years, developed eyes, developed appendages, developed mouths and internal organs. Those rocks are preserved inside the Grand Canyon.
Everything became complex, and it's almost like this was a turning point in the history of life on Earth. Never again has there been such an event. Once that complexity evolved for the very first time, it remained ever since. How can everything suddenly do that at the same time? It seems quite improbable if there's no direction to evolution.
There is an arrow to evolutionary time. Things are getting more complex. So we see very simple things at the beginning. We see 3.5 billion years ago, just single-celled organisms. And then maybe about 1 billion years ago, we see multicellular organisms coming to being. And then we see this huge explosion of complexity happening in the last 500 million years since the Cambrian explosion, a very good name for it, explosion of diversity.
The fossils contained in the world's rocks provide a biography of life, showing relentless progress from simple to more complex forms. And among the most valued specimens are those such as Acanthostega, which appear to show species in transition. Living around 360 million years ago, the fins of this creature are believed to have developed into limbs that eventually allowed creatures to move onto land. Professor Jennifer Clack is the world-renowned paleontologist who unearthed the remains of this creature.
The one that I've worked on shows combinations of fish-like characters and characters of things which now have legs. So it has fingers and toes, but they're not like any of those that you see around today. So it helps us to understand the way that creatures made the transition from being swimming creatures in the water with fins to things with legs.
But the interesting thing is that 150 years of paleontology since the publication of Origin of Species has given us scores, if not hundreds, of transitional forms.
Attempting to understand and explain the astonishing progress of life is one of the greatest challenges to the human intellect. Atheists argue that all the answers lie within evolutionary biology that requires no explanation beyond itself.
I encountered Darwin's idea of natural selection, and it hit me right off. Oh, good, that explains many things that need explaining. Don't need God to explain those.
Absolutely no doubt that evolution is a fact and has taken place over the lifetime of the Earth. The best explanation that we've got for how it took place is Darwinian natural selection. If you can account for evolution without invoking a God, then God is unnecessary.
But other scientists interpret the same evidence rather differently.
The idea that Darwin left God with nothing to do is simply false. It's false in principle. You cannot deduce atheism from Darwinism. What does Darwinism propose? That there is a mechanism, natural selection. Is that in itself an argument that there is no creator who designed this mechanism? You cannot use evolution to account for its own existence.
Showing that something has a natural explanation ultimately does not take God out of the picture. And the reason for that is God, if he exists, is the author of all things natural. God is responsible for sustaining every moment and every particle of existence in the universe.
Evolution was the mechanism. It was not the insight into why, it was the insight into how, but it was God's insight, and we're now discovering it. And should that not increase our awe for the Creator as opposed to being a threat to God?
While theistic evolutionists see evolution as God's creative plan, other believers are less convinced about how much Darwinian science really explains. Dr. Stephen Meyer is one of a number of scientists who argue that the very complexity of living things shows direct evidence of intelligent design.
One of the things that the theory of intelligent design stresses that many theistic evolutionists don't is that there are features of the natural world that can lead you to the rational or logical conclusion that design was active. All biologists accept that life looks as though it were designed for a purpose. Richard Dawkins has this famous statement where he says, biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. We don't think that that appearance is an illusion. We think it's real, and that you can tell by analyzing the scientific evidence carefully.
What is intelligent design looking at? It's looking at patterns in nature best explained as a product of intelligence. One thing that will point to intelligence is the inadequacy of natural selection and other evolutionary mechanisms to account for certain patterns that we see.
Is there evidence of design in the origin of birds? Is there evidence of design in the origin of the Cambrian animals? Is there evidence of design in the origin of humans? That's certainly a logical possibility. You're seeing in nature things that we know only arise from intelligent activity. What we're saying is different from some theistic evolutionists in that we're saying that you can detect the activity of intelligence.
Yes, it's intelligent. I would say all the way through. I'm not particularly myself as a biologist or as a Christian looking for intelligence just in little bits of the story, but I'm looking at God's intelligence expressing itself like that great musician who's bringing, if you like, a great symphony of creation into being. It's a very intelligent symphony, I would say.
The advocate of intelligent design, what they do feel is that they can show that science on its own is not sufficient for explaining the diversity of life. The theistic evolutionist doesn't, if you like, attack science in that way.
The idea that intelligent design theorists reject evolution as a package is simply incorrect. Evolution has to be carefully defined, though.
It all depends on what you mean by evolution. It can mean change over time. The theory of intelligent design is not challenging the idea of change over time. It's not even challenging the idea that all organisms have evolved from a common ancestor, though some design advocates are skeptical of that.
Where intelligent design theorists have a real difficulty, though, is with natural selection acting on random variations. And even there, the intelligent design people are not saying that this doesn't work or isn't active. It's just that they're saying this is not a full account of how we got all this biological complexity and diversity that we see.
Darwin, he coined this phrase natural selection, but natural selection is really a placeholder. He really didn't understand how it was that species came and went.
A person from an intelligent design perspective is not denying natural selection. Natural selection is well proven, but natural selection is not an engine for changing creatures one to the other.
We have no evidence that the trial and error tinkering of natural selection can produce such systems. What is the evidence of natural selection? Finch beaks changing size. It's very small scale evolutionary changes. That's the only sort of direct evidence we have for the power of natural selection.
Can it explain new organs, new body plans, fundamentally new forms of life as they arise? That's where a number of people are skeptical. I'm skeptical on that score. It's possible, but there's a lot of reasons to doubt it.
I think Darwin had good insights. I think natural selection was a good insight, but I think it's a very incomplete piece of the puzzle.
For at least 2 decades, Darwin himself wrestled with how to understand and explain the force driving change in the natural world. In 1953, the structure of DNA was discovered, and the science of genetics revealed a micro-world more staggering and complex than Darwin could ever have imagined. We might ask whether mind or mindlessness appears to be its driving force. DNA is a language or code carried in genes, providing full instructions for how a living creature is made. It's been compared to a spiral staircase, with each step containing crucial information. The full instruction manual for how any creature is made is called its genome. In the case of human beings, the genome contains 3 billion letters of DNA.
The human genome can be thought of as an instruction book. It's a book written in a funny language, the language of DNA, which has just 4 letters in its alphabet, A, C, G, and T.
And the particular order of those letters are what to determine what the genetic information says. So if the DNA spells out cat, C-A-T, that means one thing. If it's spelled out tac, just the opposite, T-A-C, it means something else. Your DNA is almost identical to mine, but it's not exactly identical. About 0.1% of our DNA bases are different. And since we have around 1 billion bases, that means that there are 1 million differences between you and me.
When you see a DNA in a test tube, it's just a little bit of white pellet. It looks really boring. It doesn't look interesting at all. And yet, in that DNA is encoded all the information needed to build bodies. That's really amazing.
Offspring can never be the clone of father or mother. Given the way DNA is passed from one generation to the next, each child's individuality is assured. And change, the driving force of evolution, is also inevitable.
Your DNA is a mixture. Half of the genes come from your father, half of the genes come from your mother. But the reason that you are not identical to your brother and sister is that which half you get is randomly determined at the point of conception. And that determines exactly which mix of genes you get, which makes you the unique individual that you are.
This amazing system fundamentally depends on the wonders of sexual reproduction. It's not yet known how such a sophisticated process developed.
Why are babies born young? When you think about it, it's extraordinary that 2 elderly and decayed bits of protoplasm can get together and with a simple gesture make a brand new human being. The evolution of sex is one of the biggest questions in evolution, and there are many theories about it. What it basically does is randomly jumble up the genes from generation to generation.
My awe grows by the day as these secrets get revealed, and you see what an amazing system this is, and able to produce something like the human mind from this one-dimensional 3 billion letters of script. Unbelievable.
What comes out at the end is a text. The text of the longest word we've ever discovered, the human genome, 3.5 billion letters long. Now, whatever processes are involved in that, the moment we see text with meaning, and it's a code, remember, we call it that, we infer upwards to intelligence instantly.
You're seeing in nature things that we know only arise from intelligent activity. Not from any natural process we know, but things that do arise we know from intelligent activity, like digital code.
Life can only continue because DNA has a remarkable inbuilt characteristic. At the point of conception, copies are made. But in the process, seemingly random changes can occur. An A might replace a G. It's believed that over time, such changes or mutations drive evolution. If nature alone is the author of everything, then maybe all of life is driven by random change.
Evolution works on mutations. Mutations are happening all the time. With every generation there are mutations. The positive ones are retained, the negative ones fall out of the system. So you're not seeing the body forms that have fallen away through time. You're only seeing the successful ones.
When Darwin talked about random variation, he had no idea how that variation occurred. We now know that random variation is simply the mutation of specific DNA sequences. In other words, changing an A to a G, or changing a G to a C.
Whereas theists argue that the DNA code points to intelligence,
atheists highlight the apparent randomness of changes in DNA.
Evolution is a series of successful mistakes. By mistakes, I mean mutations, errors in copying DNA, which happen pretty much at random, so I think we can call them mistakes.
The whole point of Darwinian natural selection is that it works without design, without foresight.
But theists argue a very different interpretation, seeing mutations not as errors, but as nature's freedom to change and develop within certain constraints.
If things are too rigid, nothing really new would happen. Equally, of course, if things were too unrigid, everything would fall apart and there would be no new things persisting. So you need a world in which there is a balance between chance and necessity, between lawful order and openness to the future. I believe that this interplay between chance and necessity reflects two of the gifts that the Creator God has given to creation.
According to the evolutionary account, so many random changes build up over long periods of time that creatures begin to diverge from one another, and eventually new species emerge. Despite their obvious differences, these species share vast amounts of DNA, leading evolutionary scientists to conclude they have come from a common origin, as Darwin had speculated.
All of life on Earth, from the simplest bacterium to a slime mold, to a redwood tree, to a bird, to a mushroom, to a human being, is remarkably similar at the molecular level, shockingly similar.
Look at the hands of an orangutan. Wow, you suddenly see they look pretty much like our hands, don't they? So they're built by the same sets of DNA.
You can go to all of mammals and see the very striking similarities. There are very few genes in the human genome that you can't find a match for in a mouse or a rat or a horse or a dog.
Scientists themselves are aware that it is an astonishing story.
I sometimes think of it as being a factory for making almost impossible things. Everybody watching this program is an almost impossible thing.
Anybody who tries to tell you that the study of the scientific basis of human biology is going to diminish your sense of awe is just not really looked closely at the experience.
Perhaps more than any other scientist, Charles Darwin brings the God question into sharp focus and calls upon us to decide if what science reveals about the wonders of life is driven by mindlessness or by mind.
This is like a drama, isn't it? This is like a drama where we're all actors on a stage. And it seems to me a much better explanation for the overall existence of this drama, if there is a God who exists who has intentions and purposes for us on this dramatic stage.
Life is an extraordinary process of propagating errors, and the errors might lead to you and me.
The fact that it's mind-boggling does not suggest that it's false, because the alternative is just as mind-boggling. But in this case, I think there's much better evidence for the evolutionary story than for the God story.
Well, Daniel Dennett likes to argue that nature is indeed self-sufficient, that nature is capable of generating the living organisms we see around us, and actually capable of generating us. You have to ask yourself the question, why does the natural world work that way? And the theist answer, of course, is because the universe reflects a deeper intelligence, the intelligence of its creator. And that's one of the reasons why ultimately evolutionary biology and religious belief do not have to be in conflict.
Planet Earth, pulsating with diverse life. How did it emerge? Addressing the question, Charles Darwin and evolution by natural selection. Examining evidence in fossils and in DNA. Investigating how much Darwinism really explains. Does Darwin reveal the hand of the Creator? Or does he dispense with God? In part 2 of Life, Evolution and the God Question, the mystery surrounding the origin of life.
Natural processes can transmit information, but there's no evidence that they can originate it.
Appreciating how planet Earth uniquely supports and nourishes life.
If it weren't for that, we wouldn't be here.
And posing the fundamental question,
can a Darwinian be a Christian? Yes, but it's not easy, but whoever said the important questions in life are easy?
I would accuse God of having played a malicious trick in providing all the evidence that he didn't exist.
There's a lot of things here that make strong atheism actually the least rational of all the choices.